Welcome, and thank you for joining this session in our DIBELS Professional Development Series, which will focus on using mCLASS to select a focus for small group instruction. My name is Wendy Brooks, and I'm the K-5 Literacy Specialist for the Teaching and Learning Literacy team at the Louisiana Department of Education. Our mission is that Louisiana students will have improved literacy outcomes through high-quality instruction and interactions by an effective teacher who is supported by leaders and families. This is done through a birth through 12th grade comprehensive approach built around 4 key literacy pillars. The first pillar involves setting, monitoring, and communicating literacy goals at the district, school, teacher, and student level. The second pillar involves providing high-quality core instruction coupled with interventions and extensions that are explicit and systematic. The third pillar involves teachers and leaders being provided with ongoing professional development opportunities. And finally, the fourth pillar involves engaging families in their child's literacy development at all ages and stages. Before we begin our new learning, I would like to anchor us in Louisiana's education priorities. By joining this session, we hope that you will be able to align your literacy instruction more closely with the science of reading, thus increasing your effectiveness as a classroom teacher. So, how do we ensure our literacy initiatives lead to improved student outcomes? We must plan for an approach that includes 3 core areas: effective practices, times effective implementation, times enabling context equals improved student outcomes. At the end of this session, participants will be able to identify how to use mCLASS literacy screener data to select an instructional focus for each small group of students, and participants will be able to practice using mCLASS literacy screener data to select an instructional focus for a small group of students within their own classroom. We will ground today's learning in the following essential question: how can classroom teachers utilize classroom literacy screener data provided by mCLASS to select an instructional focus for a small group of students that is responsive, timely, and inclusive? Once your literacy screeners have been administered, we have a wealth of information about our students at our fingertips. As teachers, we don't have a knowledge gap. Many times we simply have an action gap. Once we have all of this data, what do we actually do with it? Be sure to print the note catcher that accompanies this session to capture your thinking throughout the session. What is the purpose of the literacy screener and why is it important? From previous sessions, you should recall that the Louisiana state law requires all students in grades K through 3 be screened by a single statewide screener during the first 30 days of school, in December, and in April. The screener serves as an indicator of whether core instruction is meeting the needs of the majority of students and can also be used to identify which students may be at risk for experiencing reading difficulties so that teachers can provide timely and effective support. The literacy screener also assists in identifying students for further evaluation for specific programming, including students who display characteristics of dyslexia or being gifted. For the purposes of clarity, it helps to know that Amplify is the publisher chosen by the state to provide access to the literacy screener, and mCLASS is the name of Amplify's digital version of the screener. The literacy screener tool is DIBELS 8th edition. From your required Science of Reading training, you should recall that there are 2 main sections of the reading rope: the language comprehension side and the word recognition side. However, within those 2 main components, we must take into account the strands that are interwoven into skilled reading. A model that is based on the simple view of reading is actually highly complex. Let's connect the Dibbles literacy measures to what we know about the science of reading. Which literacy skills are assessed through the K-3 literacy screener? Our literacy screener will provide insight into the word recognition strands, phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Be sure to use the QR code for additional information about the science of reading. You should also recall that the word recognition strands of the reading rope are screened and assessed by the early literacy indicators from the K-3 literacy screener. Review the indicators and how they change across the grade levels. So now let's review what we know so far about using instructional data to make decisions inside of small group instruction. We know that universal screening is mandatory. We know that mCLASS platform provides a wealth of information based on literacy screener data for each student. However, classroom teachers need support using mCLASS literacy screener data to select an instructional focus for small groups to meet the needs of all students. What do we already know about mCLASS recommendations for instructional small groups? Remember, in previous sessions, we learned that Amplify mCLASS does the heavy lifting of the data analysis by using an algorithm that automatically forms small groups of usually 4 to 6 students who share the same instructional focus. The mCLASS algorithm draws on the most current benchmark and progress monitoring data for each student to automatically generate recommended groups of students. This feature supports teachers with identifying an instructional focus for each group of students in a responsive, timely, and inclusive manner. When you log into your mCLASS account, you will be able to view your class summary. Remember, the class summary provides a broad view of the areas of strength and needed support for a whole group of students. The summary should serve as a starting point for instructional decision-making. For example, I can see that there are 15 students in this first grade class. By looking at the column for the composite score, I can see that a combined 47% of the students are performing below or well below benchmark. The remaining columns indicate performance percentages for students across the individual Dibbles indicators. Also, you should recall that the mCLASS algorithm automatically generates group of students according to the latest available assessment data. The observed patterns of the students are noted for each group. Be sure to periodically click Update Recommendations to ensure that the most current assessment data is used to generate the instructional recommendations. As teachers progress monitor, they can click Update Recommendations for students to be regrouped as needed. Intervention groupings should be intentional and flexible. Take a moment to pause and record your learning thus far around the mCLASS class summary on your note catcher. How can I use mCLASS to select an instructional focus for small groups? Based on the observed patterns of response from the most recent literacy screener, the mCLASS algorithm automatically generated this group of 4 students. This recommended group of first grade students has a larger gap in phonemic awareness and will need strategic intervention and support for their learning to close the gap. The student responses showed that all 4 of the students are in need of support with identifying first, middle, and last sounds in words with 3 or more phonemes, and they also need to continue building fluency with phoneme segmentation. The observed patterns of responses for this small group of students will still leave us with far too many instructional activities from which to choose. Notice that in addition to needing support with segmenting words with 2 to 3 phonemes, This group of students also tends to make random errors. Reading may be accurate at times, but slower than expected. So, how can we use the observed response patterns and this information to select a focus for small group instruction? This group of students can segment some word parts. The teacher would need to decide then whether to focus on segmenting words with only two phonemes or to proceed with words that contain two to three phonemes. Because the students have established some proficiency with segmenting word parts, the teacher may conclude that the students are ready to work with words that contain both two and three phonemes. If the teacher decides to focus on segmenting words with two to three phonemes, this skill would need to be selected from the list. Making this selection will narrow the instructional focus and populate a set of appropriately aligned instructional activities. Selecting an observed response pattern on which to focus the instruction will generate a bank of instructional activities that will support growth in the identified skill. These activities were generated by the mCLASS algorithm because they all reinforce phonemic awareness. We will need to look more closely to identify this activities that will support the segmenting of words with two to three phonemes. Here are some examples of the activities that were identified by mCLASS to support this example group of students. Clicking on the name of each of the instructional activities will allow the teacher to view, save, and print activities for use during small group instruction. All of the mCLASS instructional activities are based on effective teaching practices, but it is still important to be intentional when selecting which activities will best meet the needs of individual groups of students. Like all structured literacy lessons, teachers should strategically look for small group instructional activities from mCLASS that provide preparation instructions for the teacher, a warm-up activity to prepare for new learning, instructions for the explicit modeling by the teacher, instructions for guided practice with the students, opportunities for applied practice and transfer for students, additional recommendations for support and extensions or challenges, and instructions for wrapping up the lesson. Let's take a look at scenario 1, Lucky Dip. Before we proceed though, please take a moment to pause and jot down your thinking thus far on your note catcher. Scenario 1, selecting data-driven instructional activities. Here is a strong example of an intervention lesson called Lucky Dip that is designed to support phonemic awareness through the oral blending of sounds. Notice the purpose of the lesson. Students will orally blend four or more phonemes to produce single-syllable words with beginning and ending blends. Now, the sample group of students from our data need to first develop proficiency with segmenting words with two or three phonemes. But let's continue to analyze this activity to see if it meets any of our other look-fors. Notice that the Prepare section provides two clear instructions for the teacher. Print out and cut these pictures, and then it gives you the list of pictures in parentheses. Fill up a paper bag with the pictures above. Next, the warm-up serves as an introduction to the activity and prepares the students for new learning. These words are bold, indicating that the teacher should read them word for word. The teacher would say, "Let's play a game called Lucky Dip. Here's how you play. I dip into the bag and will pull out a picture, but I will keep it hidden. I will stretch out its name and then you will guess the name of the picture. Take a moment to pause and annotate on your note catcher. When selecting an instructional activity, be sure to access any links that provide printable materials and additional resources, and prepare the materials ahead of time prior to delivering the lesson. Notice the blue underlined words printed out, these pictures. Clicking on this link will open the PDF copy of printable materials that will be needed for this specific lesson. These materials can often be repurposed for independent practice during the literacy block or for practice at home. Additionally, with teacher guidance and training, the paraprofessionals or other support staff can assist with preparing these materials and even redeliver instruction or practice during the literacy block. Next, the lesson describes how the teacher should provide direct and explicit modeling of the skill, followed by instructions to provide guided practice for the students through gradual release. Take a moment to pause and read the modeling section. Remember, the bold words should ideally be read by the teacher verbatim. Pay close attention to the additional instructions, such as reach in the bag and hold it up. These clear instructions for modeling will support explicit instruction of the skill and activity. Now, take a moment to pause and read the guided practice section. Again, pay close attention to the bold words and the explicit teacher instructions. Notice that the activity provides teacher prompts for when students answer correctly as well as incorrectly. If correct and if incorrect prompts signal an opportunity for the teacher to write down anecdotal notes and to keep track of how students are responding to the instruction in real time. The lesson also provides instructions for additional practice and opportunities for transfer of skills. Take a moment to pause and read the practice section. What do you notice about the teacher language, the explicit instructions, and the prompting? Notice that prompts are provided for the teacher to increase student engagement and participation throughout the practice. The teacher prompts are provided based on whether students respond correctly or incorrectly, and a reminder is also given for the teacher to allow sufficient wait time for student responses. To further differentiate the lesson and meet the needs of all students, suggestions are offered for the teacher to provide additional support and challenge during this instructional activity. The support may be used for students who continue to show signs of struggle throughout the lesson based on the teacher's observations of the students. The challenge may be used for students who are ready for extended, more challenging practice. As students become more proficient with the activity, the teacher may even transfer the activity to partner work or individual practice. Take a moment to pause and review the support and challenge options. Finally, the lesson describes how the teacher should wrap up by recapping the learning objective for the lesson. Notice that the wrap-up is warm and encouraging while reinforcing the focus of the lesson, which was blending sounds. After analyzing this instructional activity using the recommended look-fors that we reviewed earlier, it does seem to reflect the characteristics of a strong, structured literacy lesson. However, while this lesson does support phonemic awareness, the instructional focus doesn't quite align with the selected focus for our small group of sample students. which was segmenting words with 2 or 3 phonemes. This particular lesson may not be the best option for the small group at this time, but it may be a great option for them once they are ready to move toward working with words that contain 4 or more phonemes. Take a moment to pause and record your thinking on your note catcher. For scenario 1, does this activity align with the instructional focus for the sample group of students? How might the teacher adjust the lesson to best meet the needs of a small group of students if certain look-fors are missing? Now let's take a look at scenario 2, Ralphie rhyme. Let's analyze another example of a recommended mCLASS lesson called Ralphie rhyme. This lesson will support students who need to develop phonemic awareness, specifically through orally blending words with initial blends. Take a moment to pause and review this instructional activity. You should be asking yourself questions such as, what is the purpose of the lesson? Does the purpose align with the focus identified for the small group of students? How should the teacher prepare for the students for learning using the warm-up? Again, pause and jot down your thinking on the note catcher using the recommended look-fors. Remember, our sample group of students needs support with segmenting words with 2 or 3 phonemes. While this particular activity does support phonemic awareness, the focus of the lesson is centered around orally blending words with initial consonant blends. The teacher may need to save this activity for future use or for another group. However, let's continue to analyze this lesson using our recommended look-fors. Let's continue to analyze and annotate the lesson Ralphie rhyme. Be sure to annotate the lesson and jot down your thinking using your note catcher. What is the purpose of the word bank? How should the teacher use the word bank to support the lesson? In what ways could this instructional activity be adjusted and strengthened to meet the needs of the students? Consider these questions as you pause and record your thinking on the note catcher. Remember, the mCLASS instructional activities are all based on effective teaching practices, and the algorithm assists with narrowing down the focus and providing a bank of instructional activities based on that focus. However, it is still important for the teacher to be intentional and strategic when selecting which activities will best meet the needs of individual groups of students through a progress monitoring cycle. Let's think back to scenario 1 and the look-fors that we used when selecting a strong intervention lesson for small group instruction. Take a moment to pause and review the look-fors. Notice that the instructional activity from scenario 2, Ralphie rhymes, only includes a purpose, a warm-up, and a word bank. While this activity does support the development of phonemic awareness, we know that the purpose does not quite align with the instructional focus that was selected for our sample group of students who are in need of support with segmenting words with 2 or 3 phonemes. The modeling and guided practice are actually embedded within the warm-up. The word bank provided a list of words with which to practice blending. However, the word bank did not provide much in the way of explicit instructions for the teacher or additional prompting, additional supports, or suggestions for challenging students. Finally, there was not a wrap-up or closure provided for this particular instructional activity. So take a moment to pause and consider these questions as you jot down your thinking on your note catcher. Does this activity align with the instructional focus for the sample group of students? How might the teacher adjust the lesson to best meet the needs of our small group of students if certain look-fors are missing? Keep in mind that an experienced teacher could make adjustments to the lesson and supplement some of the missing look-fors. However, this particular instructional activity does not align with our instructional focus and thus would not be the best option for supporting our sample group of students. How can I use the mCLASS small group instruction plan to plan for small group instruction? Once a teacher has gathered a set of 2 to 3 instructional activities that have been strategically chosen to provide support for instructional focus and through a screener measure, the mCLASS small group instruction plan can be a powerful tool for organizing a progress monitoring cycle. This resource can be provided and found on the mCLASS platform. The first page of the resource can be used to identify students and scores within an instructional group, identify the screener measure, identify what each student can do according to the data, identify what the students need to do, and identify zones of growth rates. The second page of this resource can be used to identify the intensity of the intervention. How many minutes per day, how many times per week during the progress monitoring cycle. It can also be used to identify the instructional focus of the intervention. For example, blending or segmenting phonemes. List instructional activities to support the instructional focus. This is where the teacher would record a set of instructional activities to use within the cycle. And finally, the plan can be used to support the duration and plan for the duration of each instructional activity. How many days will you spend on each of the selected instructional activities? All of this information can be recorded using the mCLASS small group instruction plan. We will explore this plan in future sessions. Here are some opportunities for additional practice with selecting an intervention focus and activities. Teacher leaders and coaches can provide additional practice with selecting an intervention focus and activities using these steps. Use these recommendations to guide your continued learning and to create embedded professional development opportunities during your teacher collaboration meetings. Teachers can log into your mCLASS account, choose one of the recommended small groups from your classroom based on your literacy screener data, review the recommended instructional focus and the observed response patterns for the group, select a response pattern on which you will focus your instruction, use the recommended look-fors to strategically select an intervention activity, practice analyzing and annotating the intervention activity just as we did in this session, then prepare all materials that you'll need for the intervention activity and try out the lesson with your small group of students during a progress monitoring cycle. Closing and next steps. In conclusion, teachers can use mCLASS recommendations to establish their flexible instructional groups and select an instructional focus. Teachers can use mCLASS to identify observed student response patterns demonstrated by the literacy screener data. Teachers should strategically select and annotate their intervention or small group activities for each group based on the recommended instructional focus and the observed student response patterns. Teachers should then structure each progress monitoring cycle and prepare ahead of time to deliver instruction to small groups of students. So how can we implement your new learning and assess for impact? Reflect on your previous experiences with selecting an instructional focus and activities for small groups. for small group instruction. Consider the process that we just went through during this session to use mCLASS for selecting an instructional focus and the appropriate instructional activities for small group instruction. How will you use mCLASS to select an instructional focus and instructional activities for each of your small groups in response to the assessment data? How will you increase your intentionality when selecting instructional activities? Please take a moment to pause and jot down your final reflections and next steps using your note catcher. For more resources on the literacy screener as well as goal setting, you may visit the literacy landing page, the literacy library, the resources for LIFT, DIBELS, and setting and monitoring your literacy goals. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. Thank you for joining this session.